Okay, today is November 22nd, 2011. We are beginning and finishing today learning Module 6, where we will look at some of the cultural issues in forensic interviewing. But because I had to cancel last week's class, what I'd like to do now is go back a little bit to learning Module 5, the last part of learning Module 5, and go over some of the things that were in the PowerPoints that I think need some discussion. I remember the last time we met, that was when they had the evaluations and I had to leave early around 7:30, and I tried to squeeze in recantation at the last minute, someone asked, and I did. And, I don't know that we need to revisit retraction or recantation, but that is the last stage of Roland Summit's child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome. And the studies range from anywhere from 4% to 50% of kids who take back their assertion of sexual abuse. And I'm sure I also made the observation that most of those kids affirm if they get support, if they get to someone who cares about them and addresses the issue and lets them know that it's okay, despite all the messages that they received, directly or indirectly, from the grown-ups and peers and age mates and the world around them. Recantation is a direct response to the unfolding trauma of disclosure, or what some folks call the secondary trauma. The primary trauma being what happened to the child because of the molester. The secondary trauma being the impact of disclosure and the response of the people around them. The more important that person in the child, the more important that person is in the child's life, the more impactful the response, the more likely, if it's a negative response, the more likely the child is to take it back and say it never happened. And that's intuitive, right? That's something that kind of makes sense. So if the third cousin who lives in Schenectady disapproves, you're less likely to get a recantation than if mom disapproves or is negative about it or does what I call pay lip service. They say they believe and support, but their behavior suggests otherwise. What do you think the most compelling, most obvious to kids evidence of lack of support is in forensic investigations of kids who've been sexually abused? When I say forensic, that's a clue that one's where law enforcement's involved and the person gets arrested. How might the support for dad and lack of support for the child and disbelieving the child be indirectly communicated to the child in the most compelling of ways? How do you think that might happen? I may even mentioned it last time, and I may have told you how we rebut these things. Maybe I didn't. I don't know. It was rather quick. Well, let me play out the scenario. It's 4:20 on Friday afternoon. The school learned from the guidance counselor through the school nurse via the principal that the child's stepfather, mom's husband, has been sexually abusing her for the past 4.5 years. They learned that at 10 in the morning. They called the division at 4, and they called the county prosecutor at 4:20. And it's Friday afternoon. And I say that as kind of an inside joke, right? I mean, that's the way they all feel like they come in that way, and sadly, many of them do. And it's, hey, stuff happens on Fridays, but what's troubling is, the school learned about it at 10, and we learn about it well after dismissal sometimes, and certainly later in the day most times. In any event, so that happens. We respond quickly. We interview the child. We interview mom. Mom is aghast. She can't believe this. Perhaps we interview a sibling. We talk to the guidance counselor. and maybe we discuss it with a few more folks and arrange for interviews the next day. We bring in the suspect. He's at work. He works the night shift. We bring him in. We interview him. We interrogate him, and he makes partial admissions. He admits some of it, but not all of it. By 11 o'clock that night, he's transported to the West Milford police station. He's processed, and Saturday morning, he's on Marshall Street in Paterson, New Jersey, or pick any town in any county in our state, wherever the county jail is. And he's sleeping there Saturday evening and Sunday and Monday. And things happen when people go to jail. One thing that has to happen is somebody's got to think about bail. Somebody's got to think about posting an amount of money so that this man who's accused can spend his time awaiting trial home or some other place rather than jail. When I say somebody has to do that from the accused's perspective, I mean, that's going to happen. That's going to happen. Even if he has no friends or relatives, it's going to happen. And if he doesn't make bail, he will stay in the county jail for as long as it takes to get to the trial. So with that long-winded cue, what do you think, what kind of things might happen that communicate to the child that she's not believed, or she doesn't have mom's support, or anyone else's? Go ahead, you know the answer. Say it.
Preoccupied with getting dad out of jail.
Yeah.
Supportive of dad in his situation as opposed to the child in her situation.
Yeah, and you know what? And that's on the money. Thank you for sharing that. And it's more impactful than you can imagine, because I think you said mom is obsessed with, or what word did you use? Preoccupied. Yeah, that's a great word. And it is, I think, descriptive of what happens, or what could happen, and sometimes does. Because it's not easy to arrange for bail. You know? A lot of phone calls have to be made. There's a lot of crying. You have to pledge your property if you don't have money. You have to get the deed to your house. You have to contact a lawyer. You have to call up a bail bondsman. You have to show up. You have to be interviewed. Things have to happen. Well, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in the family home in front of the kid, right? So that kind of preoccupation, that kind of energy that goes into helping stepdad or whomever get out on bail is no secret within the family. And even if it's some noble mother, some noble caregiver, it's highly unlikely that that child doesn't know that those things are afoot, that they're happening. Often it happens right in front of them. So the message is loud that dad's important. And, to the child and to the siblings, they don't understand there has to be due process. I mean, we professionals, we're able to conceptualize the fact that the man is accused. He's in jail because he's waiting to be tried. He's not in jail because he molested the child yet. But to the child and to the lay people, to the siblings, to the neighborhood, he's in jail because he molested the child. And when he gets out of jail, he's out of jail because maybe it ain't true, is one way to process that event. And certainly helping, the child doesn't appreciate that jail at this point is not punitive. So helping him get out of jail sends a stark and impactful message to the child that the caregiver, no matter what she says, it's what she does. That the child is not believed. Never mind the direct statements around the house. Never mind that the mother or caregiver might say that directly. But these kind of events are very powerful, they're very potent, and they're not ambiguous to the child. They're quite clear. What else do caregivers or moms do when dad is arrested, if dad or brother or uncle or cousin or family member is arrested? make those arrangements for bail, be almost preoccupied or totally involved in that issue. What else might happen next? That, if you can believe it, is even more compelling a message to the child that they're not believed and that is most important. Franklin?
I was just going to say visits to she wants to visit the guy in the jail.
Yeah, visits to the jail. Visits to the jail. And those visits, sometimes the kid goes. Sometimes the kid has to wait in the car or in some separate space for families, right? But sometimes when the child goes, can you think of any more difficult position for the disclosing child? Can you think for any greater example, the secondary trauma of disclosure, than having to either sit outside and wait while mom visits or be in the room or nearby while she talks to him? Or when mom gets in the car or reunites with the child from that jailhouse visit, her eyes are red. The tears still on her cheeks. Sadness thick in the air on that ride home. Never mind that mom might be muttering under her breath one thing or the other, or saying something directly like, I don't know how we're going to do X, how are we going to pay the bills? How are we going to get along? But it happens. And I say to juries, and I think I made the point that we're very successful with these recantation cases. Did I tell you that? That when we go to trial on them, we very rarely lose. And I'm not saying that because it's about wins or losses. What I'm trying to emphasize here is that recantation is part of the disclosure process, and juries can be convinced that it is part of the disclosure process and that the original allegations are true. And, our success, I think, is testament to that. And other counties, I'm sure, are successful too. Now, that may be because the sample of cases, the cases that we do present to a regular jury, to a petit jury for conviction or acquittal for going to jail or not going to jail, are the stronger ones. I mean, if it's a really weak case and there's a recantation, we're not going to move forward on that one. But you can say that about any case. But that may be a factor. But there's no area in all of jurisprudence and all of the law and all of what happens in legal proceedings in courtrooms where the victim comes in and says it never happened, and the government goes forward. I made it all up, and the government goes forward. I was mad at Dad, and I fabricated this completely, and the government goes forward, and people get convicted. Nevertheless, it's not easy. It's a very peculiar posture to be in if you're a prosecuting attorney or a deputy attorney general or someone else who's attempting to prove this case to a fact finder. And I think that our success and the fact that juries embrace these cases and do convict is evidence of the reality of recantation. I guess what I'm trying to say is it makes sense. It really does. But to lay people who've never heard about the syndrome, to lay people means regular people, average people who are not professionals in this context. To lay people who've never heard this before, once they get educated on the dynamics of incest and intrafamilial sexual abuse, and once they learn the facts of this case, and you connect the dots for them, it makes a lot of sense, and they can convict, and they do. They do. In fact, it makes so much sense. One of the ways I argue this proposition to the jury is, and it's great because when you go at the end, they've heard all this information. They've been educated. It's our job, it's our challenge to teach them about how kids experience abuse and how kids tell about abuse and what their world looks like after they tell. That's our job, and that happens during the trial. We do that in two ways. One way is to bring in an expert, to bring in some experienced IFAS worker, or more often a psychologist from the community who specializes in these kinds of cases, and explain what you've learned in Learning Module 5, how kids experience abuse. We put that witness on and we teach the jury. We don't use PowerPoints, but we teach the jury how kids experience abuse. We also teach the jury how kids sometimes recant. So they learn that. And then we prosecutors, we then present evidence not only about the molest, but also evidence about the aftermath of the molest. So things that are typically irrelevant to the prosecution become relevant. What the DIFAS worker did afterwards, what he observed or she observed afterwards, what the mother's behavior was, whether they were supportive, what they said about this. Even if they said they were supportive, what did they do that might have been consistent with a lack of support? We look at those things and we offer them in evidence because they're relevant, not so much to the molest now, but to the recantation. They're relevant to the recantation. And we thoroughly debrief, we thoroughly question. When I say we, prosecutors thoroughly question child protection workers about these issues and about what the caregiver said and how they reacted and what their primary concern is. They could be an interested caregiver. They could be a caregiver who is supportive or wants to be supportive. Yet their questions, at least in the beginning, yet their questions were more about getting the electricity paid for, making the car insurance payments. And there's nothing wrong with that. You know, if your spouse or significant other or partner was hauled off and put in jail, even someone who really cares about their kids has to ask these questions. But if they're the first questions that are asked, and if they're obsessed or focusing entirely on that aspect, not on whether my daughter's going to be okay, not on, what kind of options are available to make sure she's safe, what kind of options are available to make sure she's well, make sure she doesn't have any STDs. If the focus is more about what about me, and what about my house, and what about my car insurance, and are other people going to hear about this? If that's what you're hearing as a child protection worker, we're going to tell the jury about that. The visits to the jail and the bail bondsman stuff, you can get that information. 10 years ago, you would get that information by going to talk to the bail bondsman. And you can still do that. You get a copy of something called the recognizance. The bail recognizance is the contract that the offender, the accused, signs with a commercial entity or a person who puts up bail, with the corporation that puts up bail, and it has the terms of the bail agreement. Now, if maternal grandma's house is the collateral and mom signed the recognizance, the contract, there's more evidence of mom being interested in his release and not so much in the child, right? So we look at that. And 10 years ago, we would go get the log. There's a book. You need to sign in the book when you go to the county jail to visit someone. We'd get that book. And there's other checkpoints where your visit to the jail is documented and memorialized. And they've had these checkpoints throughout the years. You'd get those things. And you'd show 1, 2, 5, 10, however many visits there were to the jail. You'd get that stuff. But now, you get video of the visit. You get video of mom sitting in the waiting room. You get video of her daughter sitting next to her. You get video of them walking through the hallway. You get video of the visits. You get videos of her demeanor, her affect, that is mom's. So that's a nice technological advance that we have. So rather than just get those books now, we call the sheriff's department and we get that video. And that is more of the connecting of the dots for the jury, so they understand what may have motivated this, other than that it was a false or fabricated allegation. In the child protection records, in the DYFS field notes on NJ Spirit, you can get information about those collateral interviews that prosecutors and law enforcement typically don't do unless there is potential for direct evidence, and that is the siblings and other persons who live in a household. A complete comprehensive investigation, those folks ought to be spoken to by law enforcement. They're typically not, for a lot of reasons. Unless the victim says, my brother saw this, or my brother was there when he drove me behind Burger King and then he told him to go in and get a burger. Then obviously law enforcement would interview, but just to find out if those other kids are well and to find out about their perceptions or their awareness of what was going on in that household, we don't do that. But you do. When I say you, most of you are child protection workers. You do that. And in a recantation case, we want to get that stuff. And you will have documented the siblings and how they feel about it. And very often, the siblings say what? Those of you who are intake workers who've interviewed siblings in intrafamilial or incest molest cases, what do the brothers and sisters sometimes say directly to you?
No.
What, Franklin?
They say no.
No what?
No, they haven't seen anything and they haven't been touched.
They haven't seen anything and they haven't been touched. And do they opine? Do they give you their opinion about their sister sometimes?
Yes.
And what's their opinion sometimes about sister who reported being molested? What do the siblings sometimes say? Come on, guys. I believe her 100%. She's my sister. She would never lie. Where do I go testify?
She may be exaggerating.
She may be exaggerating. I ain't ever seen nothing. I'm always in the room. I don't believe her. He wouldn't do something like that. That happens all the time. Not every time, but a lot. Well, guess what? I want to know that. If you're evaluating the credibility of the recantation, you want to know that. And we do know that. Because you do document that. Whether you remember it or not, you do. You do document that. And that's more of connecting the dots. And what I'm attempting to do to you is show you in a concrete way all of the different things, and more, but all the different things that impact upon that child's feelings about telling after the molest. And there are many, many more. But these are ones that we can document. You know, these are ones we can, they're three-dimensional. They're very tangible. You can put a sticker on them and wave them in front of the jury, or put a worker on the witness stand and tell about how that mom acted and what was paramount to her the day of the arrest, and, you know, put the bail bondsman on and talk about how they had to shuck and jive and shuffle all their finances and make phone calls to make sure the bail was paid for when they came to see them the day after Dad was arrested. And Mom was very vocal about that, and she called her relatives in some other country or some other state and made this all happen. Go ahead.
I was just going to ask, when a child sibling does say she's lying, does that impact a lot on the jury? I mean, that sounds like the defense would eat that up. Like, everybody says she's lying, including the kid who's in the bedroom with her.
Yeah, well, look, that's a good observation. It's a double-edged sword, but you're going to go to the jury in this kind of case with what you believe is compelling evidence and enough evidence, I don't know about compelling, but enough evidence that you think you can persuade them, and putting in evidence that the children were in disbelief could undermine, but the way you asked the worker questions might take that away. Were they supportive? What were they concerned about? Did they believe her? They didn't believe her? I wouldn't worry too much about getting that in, that statement. Their subjective opinion about whether they believe that their sibling or not, I would argue to the jury, is not important. It's not meaningful. But yeah, jurors would say, well, if they don't believe it, but you're beyond that by the time you're getting into these issues. You need to present the cycle of disbelief, not the cycle, the continuum of disbelief that is unfolding around her to beat the recantation, to make it understandable to the jury. So you're going to have to live with that disbelief. That's the point. And you're going to have good enough evidence to trump that disbelief, or you wouldn't be there now. And the biggest person, the biggest obstacle is mom's disbelief. They'll testify for the accused. It'll be obvious whose side she's on, and they'll testify for her. So you're going to live with that. You're going to have that in the case anyway. So you're really not putting something in. But it is, it has the capacity to undermine, and you need to address that with the jury and say, look, this is an 8-year-old kid whose bedroom was on the other side. Whether the kid says it or not, the jury's going to know these people live in the house. And we didn't put them on a stand, and they don't have any information at best for us, and they may have information that hurts us, but if they did, the defense would put it on. I don't worry too much about that. What I want to do is show the jury that there was no support in the household at all. And it was deep, and if the siblings are on board with the mom and everybody else, it was universal. And you can present that evidence to jury, and then you connect the dots. And what I sometimes say, ladies and gentlemen, when you think about it, it's amazing to me that some kids don't recant. It seems like all kids should recant. All kids should take it back. If you lived what this little girl lived through, it would be shocking to me if she didn't come in a few days later and say, it never happened. Think about it. The magic and power in those words from the child's perspective. I made it up, and it all goes away, but it don't work that way, and it didn't work that way here. Because we know better. The other thing that kids have a tough time with, and why recantation prosecutions are so successful and very difficult from the defense perspective is, and I think I made this observation at the end of class 2 weeks ago, is that the lie, the motive for the lie is so disproportionate to the lie. And that's why you need to react quickly. You go meet the child and you say, well, is there a reason that you lied about this? You're saying that it didn't happen and you made it all up. What made you want to get dad or uncle in trouble? And teenagers gets a little dicey. It's not that clear cut. It's not that disproportionate. But most of the smaller kids, they say the silliest things. He wouldn't let me go out. He wouldn't let me ride my bike. He was yelled at me for not cleaning my room. This doesn't have much traction as a basis for the original lie. It doesn't make much sense, and we emphasize that. And you want to get that right away. You want to document the child's motive in telling the lie, the false accusation. What was that all about? And very often, it's disproportionate. Whatever their motive was is disproportionate to the lie. And that can help you with jurors as well. And if there's someone who cares about that kid and shows some support, most of these kids are going to affirm anyway. Some don't, and you wind up going to trial on them. But many do. Especially when you take away control from them. They think they have the power, and it's reinforced by the people who believe in the innocence of the person. They think they have the power to reverse the course of events, to change the future. And once you explain to them that this isn't little girl versus stepdad or uncle, it's the state of New Jersey versus them, and no matter what they do, the case will go forward. They may not affirm that night, they may never affirm, but most, if there's some support from someone, even a clinician or some other family member, most of them will affirm. And I believe a large part of that, or a significant part of that, is they understand that it's not going to go away and that they don't have the power, that the case will go on no matter what they say now. And that's what we tell them. I've said to kids, look, I know what you're saying today, and I know what you said, the other day or 6 months ago or whenever. And I choose to believe you when you came here the first time. I listened to you, and I'm saying as an advocate, as a prosecutor who's going to go forward, I listened to you, and what you said made sense, and I believed you, and I still believe you. I believe every word of what you said. And I know now you're saying it didn't happen, and that's okay. Because I know why you're saying that. And it's okay to say that, and you can keep saying that. But we're going to go forward, and there's still going to be a trial, and you can come into court and say that it didn't happen. You're not going to get in trouble for me. And they come in. Some of them change their tune, and some of them come in and say it didn't happen. Any questions about retraction? Yeah.
You may have touched on it, but I walked in a little late. What if maybe mom was caught coaching the child to retract? Would mom get any type of penalty? Or?
Yeah, the question is, what about if mom was coaching the child to retract? Yeah, that would be tampering with a witness. And sometimes there's real good evidence of that, and we might charge mom with tampering with a witness. But very often, although it's a strong circumstantial case against mom, there's nothing direct. It just comes from these messages the child gets, the environment in which they live, the behavior of the caregivers, and we don't prosecute. And the other reason is you don't want to pile on. I'm not saying to tolerate that. It's not good. We shouldn't tamper with witnesses. But if you are a progressive prosecutor and you care about the child and you want to do what it is that causes that child the least harm in the long term and the short term, you're not going to prosecute mom. But you could, and sometimes we do. But most of the time we don't. And then the child's disclosure is the worst case scenario. Dad's gone, and now we've taken mom away. And you also think about, you still want the child to testify, and you still want them to think that you care about her, and that you're fair. They may not get that if you arrest mom, and you're going to have a much more difficult time. But that's not really what motivates us prosecutors. I would suggest It's more about, caring about the child. I mean, the last thing we want to do here is take her away, he's in jail, and then everybody's in foster care or living with relatives. But sometimes you have to. Sometimes the caregiver's behavior is so defiant and so egregious that has to happen. Someone had...
I was just going to say, I had a case like that, sexual abuse,
Uh-huh.
and I was taking the child to RDTC for an evaluation,
Yeah.
and actually her siblings. And I had my coworker, and he speaks Creole, and the mother didn't know that he spoke Creole. And she was telling the kids in the back seat, telling them that, if they ask you any questions, you say you don't know anything, and, tell them that you miss your dad and you want him to come back home and everything. So then we confronted her about it, but then the prosecutor's office didn't want to charge mom with tampering because they felt that, if she gets arrested, then the children will have to be placed, and that the chances of the child recanting would be much higher. So they didn't charge mom.
Yeah. Yeah. That's pretty much what I've been expressing now. Yeah. And we get, we get those now and then too, where they're directly tampering with the child and they don't understand that the worker or the detective speaks Creole, Spanish, Arabic, whatever. Someone else? Among the slides on how kids experience abuse was Finkelhor and Brown's landmark work in '85 to the traumagenic model, and I'm not going to go over that. There are strong parallels between that and the syndrome. But I do want to talk a little bit about or share with you not only the victim responses to abuse, but what some of the research tells us about the likelihood of those responses. Excuse me. And I'm talking about short-term and long-term, right? Kids are going to experience depression and a variety of anxiety disorders, and some of the kids that are really affected by this can get involved with self-injurious behaviors, cuttings, have self-esteem issues, tremendous self-esteem issues, sexual behavior, promiscuity, acting out. And many of these things last a long, long time. Trust is often shattered forever. And we know those. They're well chronicled. There are others. But what are factors in whether these things last or not, and how severe they are? There's anxiety and there's anxiety. There's sleep problems, and then there's people who have a lifetime of sleep problems. And some people can hardly trust. Some people can't trust at all. So there's a lot of variability on how impactful these responses to abuse are. And the research tells us that the factors that give us insight on the impact of abuse include, how long it went on, how often it happened, whether there was force involved or terror, how intrusive it was. Was it a fondling over the clothes, or was it penetrating? All of those things interact with one another. And other maltreatment might impact as well, whether there was physical abuse in addition to sexual abuse. Who the molester was, what the relationship is. So someone who is fondled by their father 2 or 3 times may suffer deep psychological consequences for a real long time than someone who may have been digitally penetrated by a stranger 1 or 2 times. I mean, they both are likely to experience trauma. But the betrayal by your father or a trusted person or someone who is your caregiver can be far more impactful than if you were exploited by a stranger. I mean, there is no greater, more significant, more indelible and enduring breach of trust than to have your father or your stepfather or your mother or someone that is supposed to care for you instead have sexual acts with you. There is some suggestion that the age at the time the kids tell is related to the impact of the abuse, how long they are having physical and psychological issues. Gender might be relevant. They're still studying that. But certainly I would suggest the closeness of the relationship is probably the most important in figuring out how severe the consequences of abuse are upon any particular victim. And then how long and how intrusive.
The closeness of the relationship, does that just pertain how close the perp is to the child, or maybe how close the perp is to the mother? Maybe that's why the child isn't involved.
Well, we're not talking about whether they tell or not. We're talking about whether...
We can't.
No, we're not talking about recantation anymore. I'm looking at or talking about whether they're depressed, or they cut themselves, or they can't form a relationship with a partner, an intimate partner. You know, as they grow up, these kids have a hard time engaging in normal relationships and in day-to-day living. They're sad, they have low self-esteem, they're depressed, they go from boyfriend to boyfriend, they don't trust others, they may even hurt themselves, they may turn to drugs, they may become sexually promiscuous. All these things happen to some abused children, many abused children. So we're saying, like, well, what makes that happen? How come some kids grow up into a lifetime of sadness and depression and anxiety and failed relationships and sexual promise? And some kids, it's less. And some kids function pretty well as adults and have some problems, but not deep problems that are disruptive of day-to-day life. And what I'm expressing now is that the research has identified that the closeness of the relationship is important in figuring out whether that kid's going to have a lifetime of sadness. And I just use that word generically as an umbrella for all the bad, negative, psychological consequences and physical consequences. They get stomach pains. They get sick all the time. They have physical manifestations, which is related to their psychological state. It's all intertwined. The physical and the psychological they're inextricably intertwined. They're connected. So how close the relationship was between the accused, forget about accused, the molester and the child. And then, I think that's the most important thing. I think that's the most destructive for the future. I think that a kid who's molested by their father is going to have a lifetime of issues. How severe they are depends upon each kid. Now, what are other factors? How long they were being molested, and how intrusive the molestation was, as well as the other ones I mentioned. But those are the big three, right? How long, who did it, and what did they do? So a stranger fondle is quite different from a father fondle. Quite different. And it's going to have a more enduring psychological and physical impact as that child develops into a woman or a man.
What about the, not just like the relationship as far as father, daughter, mother, son, but the relationship that that child has with a person? Could that be synonymous to father, someone who's like you know, close?
Yeah, it's not about it's not about father. It's all about father-daughter, and not about father-daughter. What I mean by that is, you know, your parents are the most significant. You have the most significant relationships of your existence with your parents, right? I mean, whether it's good or bad, it's significant. It's your parents. They gave birth to you. They care for you. So it is an especially close relationship, and it's a relationship that is built on the blindest of trust. I mean, if you can't trust your mother, your father, who are you going to trust, right? So if you look at it, it's about father and not about father. What it's about is trust and the closeness and the depth of that relationship. And you can have a close, deep relationship and a trusting relationship with anybody. And if that is breached, if that is disrupted in a way that's completely inconsistent with what you thought was the relationship, then you're going to have issues. It's hard to put yourself in that position again. I ride a motorcycle. If I get hit by a car making a left-hand turn, I'm going to be jittery when I make left-hand turns. I'm not going to trust left-hand turns. That's probably a poor analogy, but if you have a deep, mutual, intimate, trusting, close relationship with another person, and it's not only is it a sham, but it's exploited and you were used, that's tough to rebound from. And that's what parental relationships are like. And if there's some other human you have a relationship like that, you're going to have some issues. Yeah.
We read a couple of chapters ago where some children just never knew that something was wrong.
Right.
It said like 40% of kids never disclosed because they didn't think that what dad was doing was wrong or not normative. Do those children, I was, trying to wrap my head around when it becomes apparent to them, and do they suffer less as a result when they're older if they felt that this was something every father and daughter did?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't know the answer to that, but I can speculate. And I think you want to jump right out and say, nah, it's different. But it may be until they realize what happened. And I don't know. I think, again, I'm just intuiting. I'm just basing this on my thoughts and my experience. But we'd have to look at the research. There's some great research out there. I have a couple of colleagues who've done research themselves on these issues. And one of them did a long project called Listening to Kids in the 90s, where they spent many years listening to kids who were victims just like this. So that answer may be out there because there's plenty of research. But I feel like, and to put a hypothetical out there that seems like your question, let's say a child's molested between 3 and 8. And she doesn't, father is molesting her in a variety of ways in the context of a game, and she doesn't realize it's wrong, and she may even like the game. It may be fun, it may feel good, and all those things. And then somehow it slips out with an accidental disclosure, to use Sorensen and Snow's model, and then everything happens, there's an investigation, and he's punished and prosecuted. Now we're not worried about the forensic aspects of it. The question is, well, that kid who, as it was happening, didn't realize they were being exploited, didn't feel exploited, and didn't feel betrayed. Does that kid do better then in life? Generally speaking, everything's variable, depends upon the person and the personality, but generally, does that kid do better than a kid who's molested between 8 and 11 and hides under the covers because daddy's going to come in the room and fondle her and do the same exact sex acts on her? And, I think intuition suggests that, that kid should do better because at the time it was happening, they didn't know anything was wrong. So where's the trauma? What's going to cause them to be upset as life goes on? But then the question becomes, what happens when they realize what happened? Even then, I feel the realization. I gotta feel that the realization, and it could be the psychological impact of realizing that can be very significant and can cause a lot of life's issues, I'm sure. But I got to feel that the kid who's experiencing the betrayal and aware of it's going to do worse than the kid, all things being equal, doing worse than the kid who's not experiencing it at the time. But I don't know. That's just speculation. And, they can be a mess and the other kid could be a little bit better. I'm not sure. It's an interesting question. I'll have to talk to some of my colleagues about that. Any other questions? All right. Well, on this issue, I have not yet, and I apologize, I have not yet graded your Jane Doe Learning Project 2s. I did scan a few of them. I might have graded one person's. Who got their grade? Does someone here got their grade? I graded yours?
I think so.
Okay. Well, yours happened to be on top for some. I don't know. I graded one person, the first answer. What's your last name begin with?
Luke's.
Luke's? No. Well, maybe. I don't know. But I graded one. Wow. Was that something else, that handwritten document? I mean, you couldn't. If you gave her the syndrome to read and said, draft a narrative about a human's life that touches upon all these things, and I want to read it, you couldn't have got anything more compelling, I think, than what that young woman wrote. And her siblings were molested too, as she tells us in the narrative. Hers was the most intrusive. They lived at a state when they made the disclosure as adults, in their 30s, I believe, late 20s, 30s, something like that. So, I won't tell you the state, but let's say they lived in Oklahoma. They walked into the Oklahoma City PD, and it's one of these joints where they go, oh, here's a pen. Go in the other room and write down what happened. If somebody goes, oh, somebody broke in my coffee shop and stole all the coffee cups. Okay, go over there and write it down. Like it's one of these TV shows. And some people still do that. So she did. So that was her statement in the room the day she went to the police station. It wasn't prepped. There wasn't time to think about it. I know she had a general sense, I'm going to tell the cops what happened to me and my sister. That time has come. I don't know what her expectations were. Often we say, tell me a little bit about that. Okay, come back tomorrow or the next day or on Saturday, whatever. We'll take a full story. And especially with something like that, you want her to, think about it. If there's any documents or any things that help you remember, go look at them. Dates and places and things. But anyway, she walked in, they gave her a pen, she went in the other room, and 32 pages later. And of course, that wasn't everything, and she knew it, and everybody knew it, but that's what she wrote down. And nearly anything you can identify as being a dynamic of sexual molestation of a family member, by a family member, of a subordinate child in the household, is touched upon by that Jane Doe narrative. And it's a real good example of what some kids go through. And what's helpful is the fact that she's an adult now, telling us that she's a highly functioning adult. Typically the narratives come. I mean, there are stories just as sad as hers, but we're hearing them from kids who are not that far removed from the molest. And while they can explain what happened very nicely, it's a little bit different when you have an adult who has a complete command of language and events and is able to express themselves really, really well. She was just up here, and I was very disappointed because I had a conflict. She spoke on Victims' Rights Day or something. They invited her up from her home to talk about there's a march and a vigil, and she was here recently.
So now she's an activist?
No, not at all. I don't know. Perhaps she is in her community, but no. Our victim witness coordinator, the chief social worker in our victim witness, was impressed by her intelligence and her poise, and thought she'd be a good speaker. So she asked her, and she wanted to come, and she did. And I'm not sure what her story was. It was tough because they lived out of state, and they didn't have they didn't have a lot of money. They weren't well off, and the father pled guilty, so there wasn't a trial. And there is, I made the observation then, and I tried my best, and I worked with our victim witness people to try to get our office and someone to pay for their transportation to the sentencing so they could be heard. But there's no precedent for that. We can pay for people to come to trial. I could have paid for her to stay at a Holiday Inn for a week, back and forth, and her sisters for the trial. But when it came to the sentencing, we had to get real creative to help subsidize or help defray the cost of their trip up here, which obviously doesn't make any sense and it isn't right. But I couldn't change something that quickly. So, but we found the foundation that paid. The woman who invited her, our victim witness person, is very good, very sharp, and very networked in the victim community and the victims' rights community. And she had a source, a foundation that helped pay, and they came up, and they were heard at trial too, all the sisters. What had happened was they were now older, but the mother had another child, like a late in life child. So they're all in their 30s or whatever, and then there's a little one. And she was now older, but that's the first time they tried to tell, and they took it back. They didn't take it back, as you read in her account. She just didn't want to. They didn't want to go through with it, And they're grown-ups, and it's one thing with kids. They're in charge of what they want to do in most cases. So a good 6 or 7 years earlier, they didn't follow through, and then I think there was some talk that the mother might get a foster kid, or they might have been investing in a daycare center or something, and they heard about it, and that was the end of it. They decided to come forward, and they did. Anyway, let's take a look at, we heard a moment ago about the family that spoke Creole. And I don't know what the belief system of Creoles are or what the cultural issues are that surround the Creole community, but I suspect that it's different from Western European culture. Is Creole, those are mixtures of French and Caribbeans that settled in New Orleans or something?
Oh, yeah, originally from Haiti. Yeah.
From Haiti.
Came to New Orleans, yeah.
They came to New Orleans. So the Creole, the French, Napoleon Bonaparte, and even before he was in power, France had colonized Haiti, right? But is Creole a mixture of French and the African slaves who were brought to Haiti? What is Creole? Let's look it up.
So there are a lot of French, the same root of the word is in French.
Well, they're not.
I know, right?
There's no country Creole. There's no Creole land or people. So my sense is,
It is Haiti.
Yeah, it is.
well, I don't know that they're. Let's see what the facts are. Creole language. Oh. It's not what I want.
I don't think it's not a language.
Louisiana Creole people, now I'm using Wikipedia, but generally Wikipedia is pretty good. Louisiana Creole people refers to those who are descended from the colonial settlers in Louisiana, especially those of French and Spanish descent. The term was first used during colonial times by the settlers to refer to those who were born in the colony as opposed to those born in the Old World. After the Civil War, some, like the Creole scholars Charles Gaillet and Alcée Fortier, began to assert that the word Creole referred exclusively to people of European descent. Okay. Today, various types of Creoles exist in Louisiana. The former French Creoles are descendants of the French and Spanish. The term Creoles of color, in use in the colonial era but widely popularized in the 19th century, came to refer to a mixed race of people of African and European ancestry who were native in the area before the Louisiana Purchase. My sense was it was a mixture of cultures in Haiti and in France, and it seems like that. But in any event, what we want to focus a little bit on now is I had this here upon diversity issues in our forensic interviews, right? Because we're not only interviewing Western Europeans or American citizens, we interview kids and families from all over who have all kind of diverse backgrounds. So the question is, why do we even care about this? Well, we want to make sure the kid can be heard, right? We're doing a forensic interview. And we want to make sure that they can be heard, that we can know what happened. And we want to make sure that our cultural misunderstandings or biases don't get in the way of hearing that kid and treating that kid in the family respectfully, right? But, as always, what's good for the kid, it's good for the investigation. And before we even begin the interview, we have to think in terms of cultural sensitivity. One way to do that is to think generally about the dynamics of sexual abuse, right? That's not so much about culture, that's more about how kids experience abuse and, what are the typical shared experiences of abused kids. And we also need to be mindful of the fact that if a culture, or if the child is from a culture that has suffered discrimination, racism, or bigotry, then that child's then the impact of the molest on that child may be more pronounced than that of a child who grew up in an environment where they weren't subject to racial bigotry, discrimination, racism, and things like that. And that's an article by Gail Wyatt. Gail Wyatt wrote an article, and it's referenced in one of the articles you read by Victor Veith for today's class, and also the PowerPoint. Is that narrated PowerPoint playable? Were you able to play the narrated PowerPoint on racism? Diversity? Okay, I thought so.
I couldn't print it out.
You couldn't print it out, but there's one where I talk over the PowerPoint. Okay, I'm pretty much looking at that now. Just want to make sure that you can access that. And that's mentioned there as well. I mentioned the Gail Wyatt article, and she says, look, you got African American kids. If an African American kid, is sexually abused, especially more so some years ago, but even today, obviously, there's still an issue with racism, bigotry, and the stigmatization that arises from that, even today, sadly. But the point is that an African American child who is a victim of childhood incest may have there may be a more pronounced or a deeper or more significant impact on that child when it comes to issues of self-esteem, stigmatization, right? It's hard enough feeling that there's something wrong with you because daddy crawled in your bed, and something must be a matter with me because why me? And I feel like everybody can see now. I feel like I'm different. I feel like I'm weird. I feel like people know. I don't feel good about myself anymore. Kids, as Finkelhor and Brown say and express more compellingly than I can, that these kids have issues with self-esteem and they feel stigmatized. And now, obviously, that can be that can be compounded if you're an African American child who is stigmatized by racism and bigotry because of the color of your skin. Those kids, we have to be mindful of, can suffer even more. And they can be even more difficult to interview and feel even less about themselves than had they not been doubly stigmatized. So, we need to know about the dynamics of abuse. We need to be sensitive to the fact that some kids may have experienced similar dynamics by virtue of being a disadvantaged or discriminated against group. And, what we want to try to do is, in order to be culturally sensitive, in order to be respectful of people's backgrounds and help that child express themselves and do a good interview, we need to know who the heck lives in our community. We can't know everything about every culture. Who nods their head, who winks, and people get mad. If you touch them, it means this. If we ought to know these things, and I don't mean to joke about them, but there's, some people shake their head, it means no. Some people shake their head, it means yes. Some people shake their head and they pull out a gun and they want to shoot you. I don't know. There's a lot of variability among different cultures, and you can't know it all, nor should you. But you should identify who the dominant cultures are in your community. And you should learn a little bit about them. Unfortunately, we're going to work more often with ethnic minorities because they're overrepresented in the child welfare system. Most people who are child abuse professionals work with ethnic minorities because they're overrepresented in the child welfare system. And among those ethnic minorities are some very specific cultures. So you want to educate yourself about those cultures in your community. And you can look at it on a broad level and an individual level, right? If you're looking at the Arabic population in South Patterson, or you're looking at what community are the Creoles in? Are they by you?
Yes, we have a lot of.
Where?
In East Orange.
All right. So we want to know, why are there a lot of Creoles in East Orange? Who are these Creoles? Why East Orange? Why not West Orange? Why not Orange? Why not Livingston, Maplewood? Why not Dover? Who knows? Well, there's a reason there. You want to look at that population broadly. You want to get a sense of what brought them here. Are they Haitian Creoles or New Orleans Creoles? Did they flee Haiti because of a tyrannical dictator? What was their experience like in the country from which they fled? That can give us a lot of insight into how they feel about different things here, including government and authority and soldiers and cops and people with badges and guns. Right? So on one level, we want to learn about why these Creoles came to East Orange. And we can learn and draw some inferences about their belief system and how they view the world around them by looking at them generally as a group that came from one part of the world and settled in our community. Yes?
I think Creole is the language they speak as opposed to who they call themselves. They're Haitians, and the language that they speak is Creole.
Okay, so the Haitians who speak Creole, do all Haitians speak Creole? No, they speak French.
It's a different form of French. It's a different dialect of it.
Yeah. So the Haitians, the Creole-speaking Haitians, now I'm sure they have a shared experience, right? I mean, I'm not sure anything, but I suspect they gather together. They live in a part of Haiti. They live in a part of New Orleans and left Haiti. They live in East Orange. The Creole-speaking the Creole-speaking Haitians who came to East Orange, why? What's going on? Where are they from? What is their experience like in their country of origin or their community of origin? And we can learn a little bit about them. If it was some, if Baby Doc Duvalier persecuted Creole-speaking Haitians and sent jackbooted stormtroopers to, roust them up in the middle of the night and commit atrocities, we ought to know about that. Maybe that's why they came to East Orange. We need to know that. And then you have a family before you, right? They had a family in the car. This family. Do you remember what their name was or anything? Doesn't really matter. Just put some... The Creoles who were in the car, those folks came here for a reason, right? What's their story? There's the individual story. There's a story of, we'll call them the Joneses. The story of the only Creole Haitians named Jones, perhaps. How about what? Pierre? The Pierres. The Pierres. The Pierres may be part of the Creole-speaking Haitians who came from Haiti to East Orange. So there's that story. There's the story of what life was like for their culture in Haiti. There's also the Pierre story, too. Why did they come specifically? Maybe that was all over by the time, or, that they made the decision to move. Maybe they came to East Orange because, there was more opportunity there, or they had a relative there, or there was a job opportunity. I don't know. So you want to learn not only about that ethnic group, that cultural group, and their history, but also the individual family's history, the specific family that came to your community. Now, I know that in Middlesex County, is there someone from Middlesex here? There's a Vietnamese community. We know that any Bergen County here, there are a variety of Asians in Fort Lee, right? And what other cities in Palisades Park? And are they Korean or Japanese or, they're Korean? Chinese? Korean. Well, why, what was happening in Korea? Why is Fort Lee very Korean? What brought the Korean families there? How did that Korean family emerge in Fort Lee? And then we have this Korean family. What's their story? That's one way to educate ourselves about the people that we serve, right? And if you are serving Fort Lee, if that's part of your area of service and you're a child maltreatment professional, then you need to know about these people. You need to know about who they are, why they came, and you need to network. You need to make connections in that community. You need to make connections with the Korean leaders in that community. You need to make connections with the faith-based leaders. If there are Korean churches, you need to make connections with them. You need to have connections and you need to network yourself with leaders of that community so that you have a relationship with them. You can have different options. When you have a Korean family in your midst or a Creole family or some other family, you can reach out to these people to help you understand some of the dynamics and some of the cultural issues that may surround your case and this family. You want to make them part of the MDT. You want to reach out to them. If there's a strong and significant community, rest assured, there's some psychologists among them, there's some social worker, there's teachers, there's educators, and some of them may be interested in participating in the multidisciplinary team. So you want to develop links with these people. And even if they're not interested in child maltreatment, you can certainly develop those kind of relationships where you can ask them questions periodically. Other things you might be able to do is in your offices or in the centers, the child advocacy centers, to be more inviting and to help facilitate the forensic interview is to make sure that your center is reflective of the community you serve. So you want to have artwork that is diverse. And if you're in a community where there's no Asian folks, then you don't need artwork that is reflective of the Asian community. We're not decorating our centers to be diverse for diversity's sake. We're decorating them so that they are welcoming and relevant to the community we serve, and so that kids feel connected to their own communities when they come to the center. They ought to see kids on the wall or pictures on the wall or interior design that makes them feel comfortable and somewhat at home. And one way to do that is through the artwork, through the pictures, and the materials that we have. There ought to be, there ought to be documents in the languages of the community we serve. There ought to be books and magazines that are reflective of the community we serve. If there's a lot of Koreans, there ought to be some Korean books and magazines laying around that they can read. There ought to be some pictures of people that look like Korean people, as well as Western Europeans and anybody else. You certainly need interview tools like drawings and dolls, that are reflective of the communities that you serve and the race and ethnicity of the kids that you interview. Of course, each interview that we do is unique. Even interviewers from the same ethnic group might be mismatched. Different ethnic groups can work cooperatively. You don't have to have a Korean interviewer interview a Korean kid. It may be nice. It may not even be ideal. There are other things that are relevant and perhaps more important, like the competence of the interviewer. Your goal is to establish a professional relationship where people feel accepted and trusted. One of the things you want to think about is, and I mentioned it a little while ago, is what that culture's experience is with law enforcement. Because remember, ultimately, in a case that has criminal implications, police officers or persons working with police officers are going to be involved. In fact, they may be driving the investigation or heavily involved in the investigation. And you might want to know whether that culture has had a negative experience with persons who represented law enforcement in their country of origin. we used to interview kids in suits and ties, and sometimes people interviewed kids in police uniforms. Well, we don't do that anymore. Wearing plain, informal, casual clothing is the best way to, talk to these kids. I want to take a look at a couple of the articles that you read about culture. Ann Walker, and there's an article or a few pages from her book that are reproduced for you. She's that forensic linguist, and she talks about some other considerations in communicating with children and focuses on cultural differences. And she has a nice definition of culture. Those things, the attitudes, beliefs, values, and practices that we need to know to operate successfully in a society. Like language, culture binds a group of people together, separates them from others, though, as well, and can create a filter that lets in certain information and keeps other information out. And she gives us some suggestions about language and culture. For example, we talked about making kids and families feel comfortable and understanding as much as we can about different cultures, about forging relationships with cultural leaders and all that. And the reason is because when we're in an interview, we may misinterpret the child's language or statements or behavior and think they're communicating one thing when in fact they're communicating something quite differently. For example, Professor Walker observes that for Native Americans, silence is a real important part of their communication. There will be significant pauses between their phrases and sentences. They can be expressing themselves haltingly, which is not what we expect from witnesses. And now we don't have too many Native Americans in New Jersey, but in many communities they do. I work with child maltreatment professionals from all over the country. One of my colleagues, Barbara Bonner, is a professor of social work in the University of Oklahoma. She explained to me some years ago that most of the families they service in the Oklahoma area are Native American families. I don't know about, maybe not most of them, but many of them. So they're on reservations and interviewing Native American children all the time. And, they express themselves quite differently than Western Europeans or Americans. And one way that Native Americans talk is by speaking in a narrative that's punctuated by long pauses. Now, on the other hand, Professor Walker observes that African American and Jewish children can talk quite differently. They can speak rapidly. In a rapid style, their speech can overlap the person they're talking with. And that kind of rapid-fire style of speaking and overlapping speech is not considered rude. That is welcome, and that is the way that folks in some communities and families engage one another. Native Americans, Professor Walker points out, don't really emphasize the calendar. Life's events are not measurable by the calendar segments, but by seasons, ceremonies, and their daily activities. So with Native American children, how many times or when something happened may be difficult for the child to explain, And we may draw the wrong conclusion from their inability to explain. So we need to approach them differently. Professor Walker talks a little bit about color, and I know that she mentions this because there was a time where color and the color of things was something that was used in forensic interviewers during the truth-lie ritual. So if I told you this bottle of water was in a red bottle, would that be the truth or a lie? And for whatever reasons, child abuse professionals always used color in their inquiry about truth and lie. Now, early in my career, I got away from the color, and we don't even do the truth lie anymore, but I had read somewhere where you should avoid color. Firstly, because color is very subjective, and some people are colorblind. I mean, you don't want to create problems where you don't need them, and we don't really need to talk about color. It just was intuitive. People thought that was something kids can connect with, and that was the easy thing to talk about. Color. I told you this thing was green. Would that be the truth or a lie? And the thing I'm holding in my hand is black. So Professor Walker talks about color because some people were still using these color inquiries to judge the child's competence and their ability to complete the true lie questions. And she says, look, in Japan, they have a color, and I don't know if I'm saying it right, I'll call it OI, A-O-I. Ioi. That one word includes blue, green, and pale things. So blue, green, and pale things are all covered by one word. In some Native American languages, Navajo, for example, yellow, orange, and red are all the same word. They're all the same thing. There's no distinction between yellow, orange, or red. So this is another example of how color might impact a forensic interview, especially if you're asking kids whether you're telling the truth or a lie if you tell them this pen is red. If they don't have red, or they don't have the same concept of red within their culture, it can create problems. English as a second language can create problems. Deciphering what is heard in a second language is very difficult. So if a kid speaks Spanish at home, but speaks English, but their primary language is Spanish and their second language is English, they're going to have an additional burden during the interview and in the courtroom. And as Professor Walker says, they're at greater risk because first they have to decipher what is heard in a second language, and that makes it real difficult. It's compounded with rapid speech rates. It's compounded with accents, and idioms and figures of speech can really skew things and make it real hard for us to communicate properly. And the other observation Professor Walker makes is that interference from their native language can cause the child to make errors in speech and may lead to unintended meanings. She also offers this example. If you say, and this is the problem with contractions, when we talked about children and language earlier in the semester, I said try to avoid contractions if you can. Didn't, wouldn't. You couldn't see that Susie wasn't wearing her coat? Remember that lawyer's question on the PowerPoints? You couldn't see that Susie wasn't wearing her coat? So they're problematic. You have to change that around. Was Susie wearing a coat? Could you see Susie's coat? Could you see what Susie was wearing? Tell me what Susie was wearing. It's a lot of ways to say that without a contraction. Professor Walker offers this contraction. aren't you Mary Jones? If it is in fact Mary Jones, the answer should be yes, I am. Or if it's not Mary Jones, the answer is no, I'm not. That's the American way to answer that question. Polynesians, it would be the opposite. Aren't you Mary Jones? The answer yes would be, yes, I'm not Mary Jones. And no means I am Mary Jones. It's the complete opposite. And they interpret aren't you Mary Jones as, you're not Mary Jones, are you? No, that's not it.
Are you not? Wait. Yeah, the way
If you say, aren't you Mary Jones? And they say, yes, I'm not Mary Jones. So the way they're hearing that is, you are not Mary Jones. Question mark? Yes. So the answer would be yes, I'm not Mary Jones. And they're interpreting aren't you Mary Jones as you are not Mary Jones. You're not, well, I guess Americans we might say, you're not Mary Jones. We would throw in an are you? You're not Mary Jones, question mark. Yes, I'm not Mary Jones.
Because in American English, are you Mary Jones and aren't you Mary Jones are the same question.
Precisely. Because aren't has become are in that context. One of the other readings that you had just pointed out some cultural oddities, and I guess they're odd to us, but not odd to the people from those cultures. But certainly things that, if we were talking to someone from that culture, we ought to be mindful of. And this is nonverbal communication. There was the article by Singh and McKay that I gave you about, and it's really from a manual for the Peace Corps. People who travel around the world, the Peace Corps gives them a manual, depending upon where they're going, about nonverbal communication. And some of the interesting things are facial gestures. In the Western culture, eye contact is a signal for confidence or sincerity. In fact, when a person is looking down at their shoes or at the wall, not looking the interviewer in the eyes, most of the time, people think that that person is not being truthful or that they're being deceptive. They're not being honest. We expect that people who speak to people are going to look at them in the eye. Not the entire time, but look at them in the eye much of the time, rather than not look at them in the eye much of the time. We see some person staring at their feet or avoiding eye contact, we conclude they're shifty. In many cultures, including Japanese, direct and constant eye contact is rude. It's defiant. And it's almost a challenge for conflict. Japanese shift their eyes and look down to respect one another. Why is that important? You may interview a Japanese child. There may be Japanese children in Fort Lee. Their Koreans may feel the same way. I suspect I wouldn't be shocked if they didn't have the same beliefs about eye contact in Korea. In Japan and in many cultures, we don't touch other people. Now, you touch somebody here, you pat a kid on the shoulder. It's not that big a deal in America. But in some cultures, it's very rude. in Japan, if somebody's telling you a story or telling something to you and shake your head up and down, and it's kind of the way it is here though too, but the Peace Corps manual says that doesn't mean they agree with you. I mean, it means that they're listening. Doesn't necessarily mean they're agreeing with you. Doesn't necessarily mean they embrace what you're saying. It simply means they're engaged with you. Now, as a public speaker, in nearly every group I speak to, and especially large groups, and if you've spoken to groups or large groups or even small groups, there almost always is one or maybe more people who've shaken their head. And that's nice for the speaker because I can kind of focus on them because they're like, yeah, they're with me. And they teach you that in public speaking, is to kind of focus on somebody who's, you know, with you. And what's that?
Tracking.
They call that tracking? Yeah, somebody who's tracking. Somebody who's with you, somebody who's paying attention to you, somebody who's makes you feel a little calmer, and it's very effective. And there's almost always someone who does that. And I'm thinking of that when I see how in Japan people shake their head up and down, and it typically means they're listening, not necessarily agreeing. Does someone have a story or an example of a cultural, nonverbal communication that's different from us or Americans?
In Ethiopia, and it's really shocking to me. Yes, all you do is raise the eyebrows. That means yes. And no, you shrug the shoulders.
This is no?
This is no.
You want a glass of water?
Right, that's no. Do you want to come with me somewhere? Eyebrows go up, and that means yes.
Yeah, well, if I was talking to an Ethiopian woman and I said, do you want to come over to Cohen Lounge for a cup of coffee? And she went like that, I'd be like, okay. Talk about cultural miscommunication, but I did not know that. We had an Ethiopian, I had an Ethiopian student last semester. Any other ones? Any other? No one's got a cultural...
How about in Greece, they do this to come, and usually that means go away.
Uh-huh.
Like, I remember
So
when
this
in
is to
Greece,
come?
This is come here, come here.
Come here. You think this is what we would do, right?
Exactly.
Come here. You want me to come there? Yeah, come on. Yeah, come on. What do you want, me to come or to go? What do you want? What's the finger mean? This is in Barcelona?
I was crossing the street. They gave me one of these. And I realized that I did something.
I hope you had your glasses on, man.
In Barcelona.
And what does that mean? Is that the middle
The
finger?
bird, yeah. It's the middle finger. But instead of that,
Oh, that's the bird. Okay, so you would. If you didn't have your glasses on, you may have correctly interpreted it. And what's your finger mean? What were you raising that about?
Oh, the
Something.
index finger is nothing to be proud about.
It's what?
No, they use it here. The index finger.
The index finger. No, that's the middle finger.
Oh, the middle finger, right.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We know that one. That's an American one. That's an American one. Well, when I was I was fortunate enough to go to Hawaii for the National Children's Alliance. There was a summit for child advocacy centers. I think it was this. This is Hawaiian for like this. Yeah, I get. Well, I don't know. I think it's a little bit more than that. But everywhere you went, by the time I'm leaving, I'm like, hey, later, man. Mahalo. Mahalo is the term. Goodbye, hello. It's like buongiorno or bonsoir in French. But yeah, this is for the record, I have my pinky extended and my thumb perpendicular and my pinky parallel to the floor. Yeah, but that's all over Hawaii. There's that gesture, and I think it's I forget. I think it's a little more than okay. It might have some other meaning. But any other ones? Nonverbal. signs, hand signs, signals, eye movements, head shakes, rattles and rolls? Nothing.
Well, I was just had to verify it with my colleague. I noticed the thing, the lip. I noticed that in Hispanic culture, and
What's the lip? Is that it?
it's like a pointing, maybe. Let's use. I had to verify.
Oh, you mean to direct someone somewhere?
Like,
They use.
They use the lip, and you're thinking like, hey, you know, and it's more like,
Directional?
yeah,
Over
yeah.
there?
Like,
Yeah.
who you talking about? It's like two guys. And like,
Now I got it.
all that time, right?
Yeah.
Actually,
Well, see, you were mimicking it. She was doing it a little more effortlessly.
actually also push the lips, like, just a sign of rudeness.
Yeah. Where? Here, I guess.
We do that in the Caribbean, we do that,
In the Caribbean.
right? Also, some African culture, I guess that's where it came from.
Yeah.
You know.
They're pushing their lips. Interesting. The lip things, both of these lip things are new to me, but that's good. Be careful, I'm starting to lick my lips. There must be other. I remember some Italian ones too, but they're usually
The offensive ones.
the offensive ones. Yeah,
Look at that one. Do they use that in America?
I don't know that one. I mean, I don't remember that. That seemed the evil eye, right? Is that the
That's
stink
like,
eye?
I got you. It's like,
Oh.
yeah, you know, I can see through you.
Okay. You guys you're working on your learning project 3, right? So if you need any help with that or have any questions, post to the Cyber Cafe.
Open that.
Well, I put it in. I attached it to the.
You sent an email around?
Did you post in the Cyber Cafe a couple hours ago?
I did, but I didn't check that.
I replied and I was able to open it but anyway I opened the both of them and then I attached them in the Cyber Cafe to my postings. I did 2 postings in response to you, so they're sub postings, they're replies. Now they should open.